In the summer of 1836, a South Carolina architect named Robert Mills won a national competition to design a monument to George Washington, and the thing he drew was so large it sounded like a fantasy. A shaft of white marble rising 600 feet into the sky, taller than anything human beings had ever built, ringed at its base by a circle of stone columns. Almost 50 years later, on a cold afternoon in December of 1884, an Army engineer named Thomas Lincoln Casey stood at the very top of that shaft, 555 feet above the city of Washington, and watched a small point of cast aluminum lowered into place as the last stone of the tallest structure on Earth. Mills was long dead by then. He never saw a single course of marble rise. Between his drawing and Casey's capstone lay nearly half a century of money trouble, a stolen society, a civil war, and a stub of unfinished stone that an entire generation of Americans grew up believing would stand half-built forever. I went looking for how a hollow tower of marble, 55 feet square at the base, and set block by human hands, became the tallest thing in the world. What I found is one of the strangest and most stubborn building stories this country ever produced. And the proof of all of it is still hiding in plain sight, in a line you can see on the monument right now. So let me show you what it actually took, and why it almost never got built at all. To understand why the Washington Monument was so hard to raise, you have to start with a simple, slightly embarrassing fact. For decades after George Washington died, the United States had no great monument to him at all. There had been talk of one since before he was even gone. The Continental Congress voted to honor him with a statue while the Revolution was still being fought, and after his death in 1799, Congress discussed a grand tomb and a marble memorial in the new Capitol. But the money never came. The politics got in the way, and year after year, the most important figure in the founding of the country had nothing in the capital city to mark what he had done. The nation that he had helped bring into being could not seem to agree on how to remember him or how to pay for it. So in 1833, a group of private citizens in Washington decided to stop waiting for the government. They formed an organization called the Washington National Monument Society, and they set out to raise the money themselves from the people, one citizen at a time. It was a deeply democratic idea, and it carried the seed of its own trouble. The society decided that no person could give more than $1 in a single year. The thinking was noble. They wanted the monument to belong to everyone, to be paid for by ordinary Americans rather than by a handful of the wealthy. But $1 at a time is a painfully slow way to build the tallest tower in the world, and the society would spend the next decades discovering exactly how slow. In 1836, the society held its national design competition, and that is where Robert Mills comes back into the story. Mills was one of the most accomplished architects in the country, a man who had already designed major public buildings and who would go on to shape much of official Washington. His winning design was breathtaking and almost impossibly grand. A flat-topped obelisk 600 feet high would rise from the center of a great circular building, a national pantheon ringed with columns, filled with statues of the heroes of the Revolution, with George Washington himself riding above it all in a Roman chariot. It was less a monument than a temple to the founding of the country. And it would have cost a fortune that the society, collecting dollars one at a time, did not have and would never have. So the grand plan was quietly trimmed down to the part that mattered most, the towering shaft itself. The columned pantheon at the base was set aside, meant to be added later if the money ever appeared. It never did. What survived of Mills's vision was the single most recognizable shape in the American Capitol, a clean, tapering obelisk of white marble, and even that stripped-down version would push the limits of what hands and stone could do. By the late 1840s, the society had finally scraped together enough money and enough land to begin. On the 4th of July, 1848, on the open ground south of the unfinished Capitol, they laid the cornerstone of the Washington Monument. It was a national event. President James Polk was there, along with members of Congress, military companies, and a crowd that filled the field. Among the figures in that crowd were men whose names would echo through the rest of American history. A young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln among them. The cornerstone went down with full ceremony, and the country believed, that day, that its long wait was finally over. Now look at what they were actually proposing to build, because the engineering is where the wonder lives. The monument is not a solid spike of stone. It is a hollow shaft, a square tube of masonry standing on end. At the ground it measures about 55 feet on each side, and the walls there are an astonishing 15 feet thick enough to drive a wagon through. As the shaft climbs, the walls thin out, tapering and tapering until near the top. They are only about 18 inches thick. The whole structure, when it was finished, would weigh more than 40,000 tons and would contain more than 36,000 separate blocks of marble, granite, and gneiss, every single one of them quarried, cut, hauled, lifted, and set into place. There was no steel frame inside to carry the load. The stone carries itself. The wall simply has to be thick enough at the bottom to bear the crushing weight of everything stacked above it. That is the oldest idea in building, a heavy wall holding up a heavier wall, and the men who began the monument were betting that they could push that ancient idea higher than anyone in history ever had. The marble for the first stage came from a quarry near Cockeysville, Maryland, a place known as the Texas Quarry, and the early courses went up in a bright, clean white stone. At the quarry, blocks were split from the living rock and roughed out, then brought to the monument grounds where stonecutters dressed and squared them by hand, working the faces true with chisels and straightedges until each block would seat tight against its neighbors with only a thin line of mortar between. They set the stone one ring at a time, the wall rising in level bands as the masons worked their way around the square. This was slow, exacting work, and at first it was done with the simplest lifting gear, ramps and ropes, and a derrick hauling each block up to the working course. By the end of 1849, with the shaft already past 50 feet, the builders brought in their first real machine, a steam engine of about 70 horsepower, set up to hoist the heavy marble blocks to the top of the rising wall. That single engine was the only mechanical muscle on the whole early job. Even then, it only lifted. The cutting, the fitting, the bedding, and the setting were still done by the hands of the masons, exactly as they would be when the work resumed decades later. For a few years, the work went well enough. The shaft climbed past 50 feet, past 100, and the people of Washington watched their monument grow into a real and rising tower. They could see it from the streets, a clean white finger of stone climbing slowly over the low rooftops of the young capital. And then, a little over 150 feet up, the whole thing stopped. It stopped for reasons that had nothing to do with stone and everything to do with money and faction. The society had never solved its basic problem. $1 at a time was simply too little, and by the mid-1850s, the funds were running dangerously low. Then came a stranger blow. In 1854, a political movement seized control of the Monument Society itself. They were a secretive, anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic movement, and when outsiders asked them about their organization, members were told to answer that they knew nothing, which is how they came to be called the Know-Nothings. Through an irregular election, they took over the board of the Washington National Monument Society and held it for several years. Donations from the public, already thin, dried up almost completely because few Americans wanted to give their dollar to a monument controlled by that faction. The work on the shaft halted, and there it stood, a blunt, flat-topped stump of marble about 152 feet high, going nowhere. If the idea of Americans building something enormous with nothing but their hands is the kind of history you came here for, I want to point you to where so much of that hand-built confidence began. The Erie Canal, the impossible ditch dug across the whole width of New York with shovels and wheelbarrows, the project that proved this country could build at a scale the old world thought was madness. The full illustrated story of how it was dug is now a book, and you can scan the code on your screen and start reading it tonight. And then the country had far larger problems than an unfinished monument. The Civil War came, and for 4 years every spare dollar and every spare hand went to the fighting. The stub of the Washington Monument sat through the whole of it. Soldiers camped on the grounds around it. Cattle were grazed at its base to feed the troops in the city. Photographs from those years show the saddest sight imaginable. the tallest ambition in the country reduced to a squat, weather-stained block standing alone in a muddy field, ringed by army tents and grazing animals. Mark Twain, looking at it in those years, said it had the aspect of a factory chimney with the top broken off. For a generation of Americans, that broken stump was simply what the Washington Monument was. They had never seen it any other way, and many of them assumed they never would. It is worth sitting for a moment with how long that pause really was. The work stopped in the mid-1850s. It would not seriously begin again for more than 20 years. A child born the year the monument stalled could have grown into a grown man, married, and had children of his own, all while that stub of marble stood frozen at 152 feet. The country fought and survived its bloodiest war in that gap. Presidents came and went. And the whole time, the monument to the first president sat there unfinished, a national embarrassment that nobody seemed able to solve. The marble itself began to weather and stain, so that even the stone that had been laid no longer looked fresh. When the country finally turned back to the problem, the men who took it up would inherit not a clean start, but a damaged, aging, half-built thing standing on a foundation that, it turned out, was not even strong enough to finish the job. That brings us to the man who actually finished it, and to the hardest piece of engineering in the entire story. In 1878, with the nation approaching its 100th birthday and the broken monument a growing humiliation, the federal government finally took the project away from the struggling society and handed it to the United States Army Corps of Engineers. The officer placed in charge was Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Lincoln Casey. Casey was a career Army engineer, precise, demanding, and utterly methodical. And when he studied the half-built shaft, he found a frightening problem waiting under the ground. The original foundation was not strong enough. The men of the 1840s had set the monument on a base of stone rubble laid in soft, filled ground near the Potomac, ground that had once been close to marsh. That foundation could carry the 152 feet that already stood, but it could never carry the full 555 feet that Mills had drawn. The dead weight of the finished shaft would be far too much. The whole thing would settle unevenly, crack, and quite possibly lean and fall, like a far heavier version of the Leaning Tower in Pisa. Before Casey could add a single new block to the top, he had to do something that sounds almost impossible. He had to build a new, far larger foundation underneath the old one, underneath the full 250,000 tons of marble that were already standing on it, without letting the tower shift or topple while he did it. The way Casey did it is a quiet masterpiece of nerve. Working in 1879 and 1880, his crews dug out the soil from beneath the edges of the old foundation a little at a time, in carefully spaced sections, and poured a great new slab of concrete underneath and around it, slipping the new support in beneath the standing weight piece by piece. They never removed enough at once to let the tower move. When they were done, the new foundation reached about 13.5 feet deeper than the old one and covered roughly 2.5 times the area, spreading the enormous load across far more ground. The whole underpinning cost a little over $94,000, and it worked. The monument that so many had feared would crack and lean was now standing on a base that could carry it all the way to the sky. On the 7th of August, 1880, a second cornerstone was quietly set into the shaft at the 150-foot level, marking the place where the new work would join the old. And here is where the monument tells its own story on its own surface, in a detail you can still see with your own eyes. When Casey resumed the marble work, the original Maryland quarry could not supply matching stone, so his builders first tried marble from Sheffield, Massachusetts. It lasted only a few courses before quality and supply problems forced them to abandon it. They then turned to another Maryland source, the Beaver Dam Quarry, for the final 390 feet of the shaft. The new marble was close to the old, but it was not identical. It had been cut from a different ground, and it weathered to a slightly different shade. So if you stand at the base of the Washington Monument today and look up, you will see it. About a third of the way up, around that 150-foot mark, the color of the stone gently changes. Below the line, the marble carries the stain and tone of the 1840s. Above it, the stone of the 1880s. It is not damage, and it is not dirt. It is the visible scar of the Great Pause, the exact height where the country stopped for nearly a quarter century, and then found the will to begin again. Millions of visitors walk past that line every year. Most have no idea they are looking at the seam between two different Americas. Now think about how the upper 400 feet actually went up, because this is the heart of the title and the heart of the wonder. There was exactly one machine doing the heavy lifting, and it was a steam hoist. Inside the hollow shaft, a steam engine drove a lift that could carry the heavy marble blocks up the open center of the tower to where the masons were working. At the working level stood a movable iron frame about 20 feet tall, fitted with a boom and a system of ropes and pulleys, a block and tackle that the men used to swing each block off the hoist and out to its place on the wall. The steam engine lifted the stone. But the steam engine did not build anything. Every one of those 36,000 blocks was guided, squared, bedded in mortar, and set into its final position by the hands of stonemasons standing on that high, windy platform. They would raise the wall about 20 feet, then jack and move the iron frame up to the new height, then raise it 20 feet more, climbing the inside of their own tower as it grew beneath them. The lifting was steam. The building was hands. That distinction is the whole story. This was the very edge of the machine age, a moment when a steam engine could spare a man's back, but could not yet replace a mason's eye and a mason's hands. I want to be honest about those hands, because the record does not honor them the way it honors the officers. We know the names of the engineers. Thomas Lincoln Casey is carved into the capstone itself, along with his chief assistant, the civil engineer Bernard Richardson Green, who worked at Casey's side through the whole final push and went on to build the great Library of Congress. We know the name of the superintendent who ran the daily work at the top. But the masons and laborers who actually set the stone, who stood on an iron frame hundreds of feet in the air in the heat and the cold and the wind, who mixed the mortar and guided the swinging blocks, most of them are gone from the record entirely. They were the immigrant tradesmen and laborers of a growing capital, and for most of them, the ledger gives no name, only a number. They were hired, counted, paid, and replaced. Their skill is standing there in the air over Washington, perfectly plumb, perfectly true, and almost none of them got their names on anything. When you look up at that shaft and marvel that it has stood straight and sound for more than 140 years, you are looking at their work, and their work is their only signature. If you are new here, and this is the kind of history you have been hoping to find, the quiet engineering and the named and unnamed people behind the things we walk past every day, take a second to subscribe or to join the channel as a member for early access to every new film. It is the simplest way to keep work like this going. By the autumn of 1884, the masons had carried the shaft all the way up to its full design height, and only the very top remained. The monument was to be finished with a pyramid, a marble point capping the square shaft, and on the very tip of that pyramid would sit a small metal apex. The choice of metal for that apex is one of the most surprising details in the whole project, and it tells you something about how strange the world looked in 1884. The apex is made of aluminum. Today, aluminum is the cheapest of metals, the stuff of soda cans and kitchen foil, something we throw away without a thought. But in 1884, it was a precious metal, rarer and more valuable than silver. Aluminum is everywhere in the earth, locked inside common clay and ore, but separating it out was so difficult that for most of the 1800s, only tiny amounts could be made, and it cost a fortune. The Emperor of France was said to have served as most honored guests on aluminum plates, while lesser guests made do with mere gold. So when the builders of the Washington Monument wanted the finest possible point for the top of the nation's tallest structure, they chose the most exotic metal of the age. They commissioned a small cast aluminum apex from a metal worker in Philadelphia named William Frischmuth. It stands about 9 inches tall and a little under 6 inches square at its base, and it weighs 100 ounces. At the time, it was among the largest single pieces of aluminum ever cast, and at about $1.10 an ounce, the metal alone cost roughly twice its weight in silver. Before it went up, that little aluminum point was actually put on public display in New York, where people could step over it for luck, so that they might say they had stepped over the top of the Washington Monument. The choice of aluminum was not only about showing off the rarest metal of the day. Aluminum conducts electricity beautifully, and the apex was meant to serve as the very tip of the monument's lightning protection, a fine point of metal at the highest place for miles, to gather the strike and carry it safely down. The most precious metal in America was set on top of the tallest stone in the world to take the lightning so the marble would not. On the 6th of December, 1884, the last act played out at the top of the world. High above the city, on the open platform at the peak of the shaft, the workmen set the marble capstone, a single pyramid block weighing about 3,300 pounds, into its final place. The superintendent of the work, a man named P.H. McLaughlin, climbed up and set the little aluminum apex onto the very point of the capstone, with Colonel Casey overseeing it all, in a stiff wind at around 2:17 in the afternoon. And in that moment, with that small, bright point of metal locked into place, the Washington Monument was complete. 555 feet and 5 inches of marble, granite, and gneiss, raised from a foundation that had nearly failed, paused for a generation, and finished at last by hand. It was, that afternoon, the tallest structure that human beings had ever built. The formal dedication came a few months later, on the 21st of February, 1885, in bitter winter cold, with President Chester Arthur presiding. And the monument was finally opened to the public on the 9th of October, 1888, after the inside was fitted out and a steam elevator installed to carry visitors up the hollow center. From that point on, ordinary people could ride to the top of the tallest thing in the world and look out over the Capitol from a window 500 feet in the air. The total cost of the whole long effort, across all those decades, came to about $1,400,000, an enormous sum spread across 40 years of stops and starts. That first elevator is a small marvel of its own, and a window into how new and how nervous the technology still was. The original steam-powered elevator took 10 to 12 minutes to grind its slow way to the top, and in the early years, it was thought safe enough for men, but not for women and children, who were quietly advised to take the stairs instead. And there were stairs, an iron stairway built up the inside of the hollow shaft, winding around the open center with its landings and its memorial stones, 897 steps from the ground to the observation level. Climbing the whole height by foot was a real undertaking, hundreds of feet of iron treads spiraling up through the cool, dim interior of a marble tower. For more than a century, people climbed those stairs, paused at the carved stones along the way, and emerged at the top into the light and the wind. And the wind is the last piece of the engineering wonder, the part that says the most about how well the old masons built. A tower 555 feet tall and only 55 feet square at the base is a slender thing, and slender towers move in the wind. They have to, because a structure that could not give it all would crack. So the Washington Monument sways. But the astonishing thing is how little it sways. In a stiff wind of about 30 miles an hour, the very top of the monument moves only about 1/8 of an inch. 555 feet of stacked stone leaning into a hard wind, and the top drifts less than the width of a finger. That is the precision the masons built into it by hand, course on course, each ring sitting so true on the one below that the whole tower behaves almost as a single carved stone. It has stood through storms, through more than 140 years of weather, and through an earthquake in 2011 that cracked some of the stones and closed it for repairs. And through all of it, the line has held nearly perfectly plumb. They built it to give a little and hold forever. And so far, it has. For a few short years, the Washington Monument held the title outright. From its completion in 1884, it was the tallest structure on the face of the earth, taller than the Great Pyramids of Egypt, taller than the soaring spires of Cologne Cathedral, which it had finally passed. For thousands of years, the tallest things humans had ever made were the pyramids and the cathedrals, and now the record belonged to a marble obelisk on the banks of the Potomac, built to honor an American farmer general. That reign at the top was brief. In 1889, just 5 years later, the Eiffel Tower rose in Paris and nearly doubled the monument's height, and the age of iron and then steel took the record away from stone for good. The Washington Monument was the last time in human history that the tallest structure in the world would be made of stacked stone. After it, every record holder would be a skeleton of metal. So it stands at a hinge in the whole long story of building, the final, highest word of the age of the heavy wall, raised just before the machines made the heavy wall obsolete. To this day, it remains the tallest stone structure and the tallest obelisk in the world. Nothing built of stacked masonry has ever risen higher. And inside its hollow walls, set into the stone of the stairwell, are 194 carved memorial stones, gifts sent in over the years by states and cities and societies and foreign nations, each one a block of inscribed stone added to the inside of the shaft. There is a stone from almost every state, stones from fire companies and temperance societies, stones from distant countries, even a block cut from the ancient ruins of the Temple of Concord in Rome, sent by Pope Pius IX and engraved from Rome to America. That particular gift carries a dark little tale of its own. On a March night in 1854, a band of know-nothing men crept onto the grounds, carried the Pope's stone off to a boat, smashed it, and dumped the pieces into the Potomac because they would not allow a gift from Rome into the monument. The block in the wall today is a replacement, set there in modern times. So even the inside of the shaft carries the marks of the same faction that froze the work for a generation. The monument is a tower on the outside and a kind of national scrapbook in stone on the inside, a record of who wanted to be part of remembering George Washington and of who did not. I should be honest about one modern wrinkle, because the easy number is not quite the final number. For 130 years, everyone agreed the monument stood 555 feet and 5 inches tall, and that is the figure carved into the public memory. But in 2014, the National Park Service had the monument resurveyed with modern instruments and to a modern definition of exactly where the ground level sits, and the new measurement came out a little shorter, about 554 feet and 7 inches. The monument did not shrink. The stone has not moved. What changed was the precision of the measuring and the rule for where you start counting from the base. The historic height, the one that stood for over a century and the one the builders themselves recorded in 1884, is 555 feet, and that is the number that belongs to this story. So step back and take in the whole arc of it. A grand drawing in 1836 by a man who would die without seeing a stone of it raised. A democratic society collecting dollars one at a time and never quite collecting enough. A cornerstone in 1848, then a stall at 152 feet, a stolen board, a civil war, and a broken stump standing in a cattle field for the better part of a generation. Then a careful army engineer who slid a new foundation under 250,000 tons of standing marble found new stone that left a permanent scar of color in the shaft, and drove the tower the rest of the way to the sky with a steam hoist and the hands of unnamed masons. A precious metal point set on top in a December wind. The tallest thing on earth for 5 short years, made entirely of stacked stone. It is, when you lay it all out, one of the most improbable building stories in the country's history, and it ended in the single most familiar shape in the American capital. Which leaves me with a question I want to hand to you, because I genuinely go back and forth on it. We tend to assume that the great monuments of the ancient world, the pyramids and the cathedrals, belong to a vanished age of patient hand-building that modern people simply could not or would not repeat. But the Washington Monument is not ancient. It was finished in 1884, well within reach of living memory's grandparents, and it was built the old way, stone on stone, set by hand, the last great tower of the age of the wall raised right at the doorstep of the age of the machine. So here is what I keep turning over. If you handed a crew today the same assignment, no steel skeleton, no modern crane, just stone and mortar and the rule that it must stand 555 feet and remain perfectly plumb for 150 years, do you honestly believe we could still do it? I am not as sure as I would like to be. I think the knowledge of how to truly build in stacked stone may be one of the things the machine age quietly let us forget. I would like to hear what you think down in the comments, because I do not believe the answer is nearly as obvious as we pretend. If you want to see where this country first learned to build big with nothing but its hands, the Erie Canal that proved Americans could move earth and water on a scale the old world called impossible, the full illustrated story is waiting behind the code on your screen. Scan it, pick it up, and thank you for staying with me all the way to the top. I will see you at the next one.